Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so this conference, our sessions are 45 minutes, and then we'll transition. So instead of talking to you for 45 minutes and then doing questions for a full hour, I'm going to talk for like 30 to 35 minutes, and then there will be some time for questions at the end. If you have questions along the way, just raise your hand or shout them out. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. The mic doesn't work in this room, so okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Amy. We're here to talk about some strategic intercropping, and if you read the session description, we're going to get into some of the background of indigenous agriculture practices and in North America and Mesoamerica, and then debunk companion cropping a little bit. Hopefully things don't get too heated and nobody gets too worked up. And then I'm going to give you some strategies that you can take home and hopefully implement in your own gardening practices that are evidence-based and will be useful to you. Can you see the screen okay? Lights are good? Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm based in Johnson County in Buffalo. I originally grew up in Nebraska on family farm and ranch, and my parents always had a huge vegetable garden. So even though most of my formal education is in animal science and like livestock management, that side of things, I have always had my fingers in the soil, gardening, growing flowers, encouraging pollinators, and all of those things. So that's kind of the expertise that I'm bringing to the room today. And there's the overview. So I always like to start out my presentations by going over some vocabulary and getting everybody in the room on the same page so that we're all speaking the same language. So here are a few of the terms we're going to go through. Starting out with strategic, this one is pretty obvious, but strategic intercropping was the title of this presentation, so I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page there. Really related back to helping achieve a plan. So this is your garden plan in the context of today's talk. And now we're going to get into some of the different intercropping or multi-species agriculture terms. So intercropping is a term that comes to us from commercial production agriculture. It's typically a fairly simple system with only one, two, well, more than one, two or a few species. So you can see here in this example, this is classic intercropping from row crop, grain crops. So we've got some soybeans planted in here in between these cereal grains. The cereal grains were probably planted the fall before, overwintered, and then as those ripen, there's an opportunity to harvest those and remove that biomass off the field without impacting the soybeans, and then the soybeans are able to come up through that stubble and produce their grain crop as well. So this is intercropping in a commercial agriculture context. Maybe I touched the screen, it probably made it mad. Okay. Next term, plant associations. So this is an ecological term and is defined as plant species that are found together in natural environments. This is typically as a consequence of the moisture regime of an area, the soil conditions, temperature and climate all tie back into this. So the example that I put together for us today, the Wyoming Big Sagebrush Plant Association, sagebrush, rubber rabbit brush, a couple of our cool season perennial grasses, maybe some plains prickly pear, globe mallow. We could name other species, right? But in our sagebrush steppe ecosystems around Wyoming, these are some plants that will commonly be found growing together. And they have relationships above the soil and below the soil. Those roots grow together, and they have associations that way as well. So plant association is a term that I might throw at you as we move forward today. Nurse plant. This is a plant that is intentionally seeded to aid the development or growth of another plant. So here we've got some oats that are planted with, does anybody know this one? Alfalfa, yes. So that oat crop helps provide some shelter and structure, especially in areas where there's concern of erosion in disturbed sites and you're trying to seed an alfalfa crop. The oats are an annual, so they'll grow up, provide that shelter, modify the environment such that the alfalfa can establish, and then the oats are done, and the alfalfa will continue into the years in the future. This is also a term of ecological origin, even though I used an agricultural example here. We can find nurse plants, nurse associations in desert conditions where it's really, really arid, and even some, like a mesquite bush growing, creates enough of a difference in the microclimate that saguaro cactus can come in and establish under, and then eventually they will become the towering giants that they are. We also sometimes think of nurse plants, even though the nurse is dead at that point, fallen logs in a forest system nurses new seedlings of new trees that are coming up. Polyculture is like taking the intercropping concept and making it way more complicated. So it's typically multiple species, many species, and this one has both agriculture and ecological origin. This is the term that will be the focus of the majority of the talk moving forward, thinking about filling different roles in the ecosystem that is your garden. And some examples are hedgerows and windbreaks, thinking about trees providing shelter for crops, and then also, I don't know, maybe some decorative element in that piece as well. So there's multiple functions being contributed in polyculture. Okay, now we're getting to companion planting. So I'm just going to click through all of these so they come up. The primary thing is companion planting has entertainment value. It does not contribute a lot of scientific value when it is based on energies, vibes, crystal extracts, however else you might want to characterize your companion planting. It's not typically evidence-based, and I do put this caveat on there. There's not a lot of literature studying companion planting, so it's not entirely to blame in and of itself that there's not evidence to suggest that certain relationships are of value. I did pull a couple examples. I found one peer-reviewed, like really good research study, and then one kind of case study example that is weaker on the science end of things, but we are going to go through both of those here today. The biggest thing, and I touched the screen again, is to not anthropomorphize the plants in your garden. What does anthropomorphize mean? That's a $10 word. Anthropomorphize is assigning human characteristics to a non-human being. Hey, did we get it in the back? Great, gold star, love it. So our plants are not humans. They do not experience emotions the same way that we do. They do not vibe with each other the same way we do. And that's not to say that they don't necessarily communicate, because we do know that they communicate. They have mechanisms for that, but it's typically different than this kind of occult-leaning energy system of thought. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say on companion planting for now. Here's some examples that I pulled off social media. Maybe you've seen some of these. They're really popular in the gardening groups on Facebook. It's like the worst offender that I see. This is just a list of plants. Like, who put this together? What is the basis for this recommendation? This piece of information right here gives you none of that. Looking at this one, very similar. As I scan through it, most of it appears pretty random. We're going to get to an association with beans and corn and squash instead of potatoes here in a minute. So that one's like the closest that this one gets to being legitimate in my mind. But if you look closely, beans, cucumbers, carrots, whoops, go back, no. Oh, we're going forward. Oh, we're only going forward. All right. If you notice, okay, that top row, beans, cucumbers, carrots, they weren't even didn't put the effort in to change the text, because that's not a bean, that's not a cucumber, that's not a carrot. So like, that is the level of seriousness that you should take these graphics with that you see online. Like, these are not legitimate. Entertainment value, right? It's a pretty picture, it's colorful, it's easy to share out, but this is not providing you really any useful information. Okay, here's my disclaimer. I've been on a soapbox a little bit. I'm going to be on it a few more times, just so you know. But you got to do what works for you. University Extension provides evidence-based information. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. So that means like the process by which that information is collected is going to be representative in many different situations. So randomized controlled trials are the way to go. The differences represented are statistically significant, and that is part of the planning process in the research. It's taken into account that there are enough replicates and that the information gathered will actually have legitimate statistical difference that you can expect when that experiment is repeated into the future. So this is the information I'm going to lean on throughout this presentation. And there are ways of knowing that exist outside of this framework. This is very Western, very European, very academic ivory tower type of situation. Question?
Could you also just identify like the term permaculture as it relates to all of this? Like
yes. Great question. Permaculture fits kind of into the niche. It's kind of on the border between like evidence-based agricultural practice, but it also has a really strong philosophical kind of component to it. And there are elements of permaculture that would definitely contribute, or that would align with what I'll be presenting here today. Yeah, great question. Okay, so with that said, ways of knowing that exist outside of our Western European academic model, traditional and indigenous agriculture. So strategic intercropping as a concept has existed on this continent for thousands of years. Before permaculture was popularized by Bill Mollison, I think, was one of the driving founders of that movement. People have been farming in this way for a long time. And just because it's kind of coming back into popularity now, I think we need to maintain the perspective that this has been a way of providing food for our communities for a very, very long time. So I don't know if you can see this photo very well, but can you identify any of the species present here? Corn, squash, and beans. Okay, so it seems like everyone in the room is fairly familiar with this system. Does anybody know what it is referred to as? The three sisters. Yeah, great. So we've got the squash plants. For anybody that's maybe not familiar, squash that covers the ground serves as a living mulch, spreads out. Corn grows tall and provides that vertical structure, and then the beans that are kind of hard to see in this picture, but the beans climb up the corn stalks. This has been a way of farming on this continent for thousands of years, and we're going to get into some of the actual Western science analysis that's been conducted on this system. So we can find ways where both of these intercropping systems can grow together. Another system that's maybe a little bit less familiar is milpa. The milpa. Is anybody familiar with the milpa? So this is very, very similar to the Three Sisters concept, and is actually a way of growing throughout Mesoamerica and uses these main species, corn, zea mays, bean species, squash species, but it also incorporates others. So it goes beyond the Three Sisters and incorporates, even forb plants, weeds that might be growing in the area but contributing pollinator services, other small grain crops that might be present, and depending on where in Mesoamerica there's traditions of using like cassava and sweet potato and yam and some of those other spreading ground cover species as well. It means growing together from the Nahuatl words, the Nahuatl language. So think about this as kind of the Three Sisters system, but on steroids. It's amped up a little bit and has increased diversity. What do you notice about this image here? There's a lot of insects. Yeah. It's kind of hard to see, I know, because it's not as big as I had hoped, but do you see here there's a parasitoid wasp landing on this caterpillar? We're going to talk about encouraging beneficial insects. There's another one right here doing the same thing, I think. So there's a spider. There's some ants moving up and down this one right here. So not all of these are admittedly like desirable species, desirable insect species that we want to see in our vegetable gardens. But there's a role for all of them. Okay, we talked about the Three Sisters and the principles there. One thing I guess I didn't mention was the importance of the bean sister. And go ahead. Nitrogen fixation, yeah. So that's something that modern science has allowed us to realize is going on. The rhizobia associations with legume roots, fixing atmospheric nitrogen and converting that into a form that's usable by the plant, which is ammonia or ammonium. But this has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. So, there are multiple ways of knowing, I guess. I'll leave it at that. So this is complicated, but this is some data that we're going to get into. There was a research team in New York State researching traditional Iroquois ways of growing. So this is the Three Sisters. So to not completely overwhelm you here, we'll break down some of this data table. So we've got corn in these two columns, bean in these two columns, pumpkin in these two columns, and then these are the two study years, 93 and 94 for each of those. As we move down the rows, they were spaced at different intervals, trying to replicate what would maybe have been the historic practice. So at 30-inch spacings between the hills, 40-inch and 48-inch. So that was when they were all grown in that integrated Three Sisters method. Then moving down farther, the corn monoculture at the same spacing intervals, bean monoculture, and pumpkin monoculture. And when we're looking at scientific data like this, we're looking for where the letters are different within a column in this case. So for example, there are statistical differences here between the 30-inch and the 48-inch. So the 30-inch had statistically greater corn yield in this instance. And that was different even from the 40-inch. So those three were distinctly, significantly different, where the 48-inch was the least, which kind of makes sense intuitively, right? The spacing was greater. There were fewer plants probably on that plot, and so the crop was less. Where that gets interesting is we start looking at and comparing within the column the Three Sisters cropping to the monocultures. So we see here at the 30-inch, the Three Sisters and the corn monoculture were not different yield-wise on the corn side. We did see at the wider spacings, there was a higher productivity of the corn. So the corn actually performed not different from Three Sisters to monoculture. Now we're going to jump over here and look at the pumpkin, because this is the opposite end of the kind of how the data worked out. In 1994, there were over 30,000 pounds of pumpkin produced in monoculture. None of the Three Sisters plantings come even close to that as far as pounds. And that's not to say that there weren't other ecosystem services being performed by the pumpkin in the Three Sisters and contributing to the overall success, but pound for pound comparison against a monoculture, the numbers do not favor pumpkin or bean Corn, they were not different, really. So this, you might say, is not a great read on the situation for using Three Sisters, purely from a yield perspective. Have I completely lost everyone with this data slide? Okay, we're going to look at one more, and then we'll move on to other things, so hopefully everyone stays awake. So now we're looking at land equivalency ratios. And so what this means is looking at the amount of produce in a given area, and we're comparing the overall productivity for each land equivalent. And so the way this is calculated, we've got the polyculture, which is the Three Sisters for corn, bean, and pumpkin, and then we've got the monocultures there. The polyculture is divided by the monoculture to find the ratio. So this 0.82 comes from 1,874 divided by 2,231, gives you that 0.82. And then we're adding those together. So this, we can think of it as an efficiency, right? Like the corn polyculture is 82% efficient to a monoculture. The beans was 12% efficient relative to a bean monoculture. And the pumpkin yield was 36% efficient to if we just planted a field with pumpkins. But we add those together, and we're getting numbers that are greater than 1. So if we had gone through and we had just done a field of corn, a field of beans, and a field of pumpkins, that number would be 1 effectively. But because there are these associations between these plants happening, they're supporting each other's growth, we're getting efficiencies greater than 1. And so you can look across the 3 different sites and the different years that they evaluated this. I mean, plus 8% yield, maybe not worth it to manage an integrated intercrop system. But in years where you're getting a plus 30%, almost a full third more yield off of your field, like for a given area, and this is all like relative to the same amount of area. That's where we start to see the power of those plant associations and interrelationships coming through. This is a really abstract concept. Did I lose anybody?
It's kind of, because like look at the bean yield polyculture versus monoculture, and that first Hopkins 1993 column. Like it appears that you're getting more poundage if you do the monocultures.
Yes.
Versus if you do the polycultures. So I don't understand, I thought I heard you say that you're more efficient if you do the polycultures, but the numbers seem to indicate that you're more efficient if you do the monoculture.
Right, and so that would be if you were looking just at the beans alone. Monoculture, you're gonna get a lot more beans if you're only planting beans.
Okay.
But the land equivalent ratio is speaking to the difference between poly and monoculture. Yeah, so you have to take the polyculture comes all together as one. And so it's the corn, the beans, and the pumpkin yield accumulative. Does that make sense? Yes.
Kind of piggybacking onto that, so correct me if I'm misunderstanding this.
Sure.
But when they're looking at specifically like the pumpkin yield in the polyculture, is that solely they're only looking in that Three Sisters combination of those 3, they're only looking at the pumpkins, like how the pumpkins are growing in that particular
Correct.
study? And
Correct.
dividing that by the monocrop if it was just by itself?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you were tracking exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thought I got lost.
So no, the big takeaway from all of this information is there is potential to get beyond what that yield would be if it was monoculture by intercropping. Okay, yeah.
So I did have a question, because I grow pumpkins and corn.
Yes.
Pesticides, like managing weeds and all that,
Mm-hmm.
different for each. So is that accounted in this? Because monoculture, you'd be able to spray
Right.
whatever in control, where if they were together, you couldn't.
Yes, that is the counterbalance to this. So the question was, in monoculture, you have access to more pest management tools because herbicides would act on these plants differently. Is that accurate?
You can't spray corn and pumpkins the same.
Correct.
That'll kill it.
Right. So the balance of this additional yield is the management effort and labor that goes into caring for it. In this research specifically, they did not use any pesticides. They just let it roll because they were trying to emulate the situation for the Iroquois people in New York State with the tools that they would have had available to them. So, we are not in Mesoamerica. We are also not in New York State. Things will look a little bit different for us here in Wyoming. Results may vary, but that's what you need to be asking yourselves whenever you're reading scientific research is, where did this come from, and how are my conditions where my feet are here different than where that research took place? Okay, so you can leverage chemical and biological effects by interplanting. These are the strategies that are coming out of a paper by Linda Chalker-Scott. This was a review paper, not peer-reviewed research. But some of these have come up already. Nitrogen fixation is a big one. Salt accumulation, especially in areas of the state where there's a lot of salt in the soil. There are plant species that will be accumulators of that salt and compartmentalize that in their tissues. I think willow, I want to say willow is a good example of that. I don't know. Can you speak to that? Saltgrass, yeah, we have a lot of species. Shad scale saltbrush is another one, but some of those you might not want to be growing in your garden. Volatile and organic compounds, this is something that, like essential oils basically, that people lean a lot on, thinking about companion planting especially. And the research does not support the volatile organics really beyond a distance of like 5 meters for certain species. And others, like we can smell them, but they don't really have an effect on the insect pests that you might be trying to manage for. So that's all on the chemical side. On the biological side, enhancing biodiversity, building that ecosystem out for predatory insects and bird habitat, disrupting the behavior of harmful insects, and then also those mycorrhizal or the fungal associations that are happening between plant roots under the soil surface. This is my number one on this, enhancing biodiversity by intercropping and adding species in. That is providing many of these other benefits. So simply by enhancing the biodiversity and increasing the number of species present in your garden plot is going to have this downward cascade of benefits. This is a really, really nice publication. So here's the QR code if you want to scan that on your phone. I'll give you just a minute. And I would really recommend going home tonight and reading that in detail. Linda Chalker-Scott is a horticulture extension specialist out of Washington State University. And she has worked in this field for a very long time and has some excellent materials available on a huge range of horticultural topics. But she does a really great job going through that list of chemical and biological strategies I pulled from this document. Everybody get it? Okay. Okay, we're going to keep moving. You can catch me later if you didn't get it. So we're back to increasing biodiversity. These are the strategies that I'm giving you to take home. Increasing biodiversity, trying some trap crops potentially, and then encouraging and supporting beneficial insects in your gardens. And I know we're getting a little tight on time. I'm going to speak for maybe 5 to 8 more minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I'm used to talking for 45 minutes and then having 15 minutes of questions, so I'm having to rush through some of this. Your pest insects want an easy lunch. They want a field of the same plant that is their favorite plant that they can go to and spend all of their time in and never have to leave and never have to put forth too much energy to go find another one of those plants because there's one growing right next to the one they're on in that moment. So by adding just a few more species, this is an example of interplanting with some dill in that lettuce. And then here's another one. So this is adding 1 species. This is adding 2. This is with onions and with garlic. This is a much more confusing situation to your pest insect. They come in and they're like, whoa, where's all my lettuce? You will notice like this lettuce plant is looking kind of sad. So there are going to be a few trade-offs as far as water competition and sunlight, shading out potentially by these onions, shading out some of those lettuce plants. Those are all things that you need to manage. But adding diversity, making the environment more complex makes it more difficult for those pests to find the crops that they want to snack on. Also thinking about the ecological and spatial niches that are available to you in your garden. This Three Sisters model capitalizes on this fantastic, we've got the vining crop, we've got the very upright stalk in the grass family, and then we've got a forb that is fixing nitrogen and has a different growth habit. So thinking about all of these different things, root crops versus leafy crops. In one of those social media examples at the beginning, one of the suggestions was carrots, onions, and I think beets, leeks together. So that's 3 root crops all together. And they're in that same niche of the garden ecosystem competing for resources. So root crops and leafy crops pair well, better than trying to grow 2 root crops together because they're in that same space in your garden, physically and functionally. Trap crops are intended to attract a pest away from your cash crop, your main crop. The literature suggests that your trap crop should have at least double the pest attractivity of the cash crop. How you find that? I don't know. Observation, I guess, and pay attention to what's working for you in your garden. If there's a certain thing that, like the cabbage loopers, for example, are really going after, then maybe you can plant that in an intentional way the next year as a trap crop. Proportional amounts, so having one single, I don't know, like a Juliet cherry tomato that you intend to be your trap crop, and then having like half an acre of celebrity tomato, that's not going to work out very well because the proportions are off. So making sure that you're making that matched or better balanced. And the literature also suggests that you can pair or layer trap crops together for an enhanced effect. This really just comes back to adding biodiversity in your system, in my opinion. So here are some examples that are suggested in the reading that I did preparing for this today. Brassicas, so like your cabbage, a lot of the like Asian cabbages were used in some of the projects that I read. Broccoli and cauliflower were typically crops that were being protected by the cabbages. Buckwheat is one that's seeded in as a trap crop. Sunflowers actually work pretty effectively, and they also have the additional ecosystem function of attracting pollinators. And then for a lot of the squash pests, blue Hubbard is the common trap crop seeded to attract. And in all of these should be seeded or planted ahead of the crop that you're trying to protect by 2 weeks is the recommendation. That way these are maturing early and the pests are finding them before your crops that you're trying to protect. I put this case study in here, but for the sake of time, we're going to skip through it. There's some different schools of thought about whether to plant a perimeter versus inter-rows, alternating rows with your trap crop. And this was an anecdotal project. It was not peer-reviewed. The differences were not statistical, but they found a huge range of variability by species, by pest, and by trap crop. So the big takeaway from this project was it's going to depend a lot on what you have going on in your garden. And this is something that you can develop for yourself over several years. Like the lettuce plots were eaten by rabbits, and so they didn't really get effective data on the lettuce. And yeah, I'm going to skip through some of this. Okay, the last strategy I want to emphasize is encouraging beneficial insects, providing various habitat. a lot of the strategies in intercropping are related to thinking about the structure as it relates to insect control, structure in your garden. So we have like vertical with leaves that animals can, or like the insects can crawl into and hide. Some of these vining crops provide shelter for the soil-dwelling insects. And also thinking about having some blooming plants in or around your garden to provide nectar and pollen for some of these, especially like the predatory wasp species. Their diet is, in many cases, nectar or pollen, but they need the caterpillars of the pest species where they lay their eggs. They're not actually feeding on the caterpillars, they're feeding on nectar and pollen, and so they need flowers for that. Also, a quick note on integrated pest management, or IPM. In many cases, it is our first impulse to grab the chemical because we know it works, but we have a lot of other strategies available to us. Mulching and crop rotation as cultural control, hand picking, spraying off with water as physical and mechanical control, introducing natural predators or using BT as biological control, those all have good effect. And I want to point out, organic pesticides are still chemical control. So just that's a disclaimer there. And all of these species down here, the squash bug, the parasitic or parasitoid wasps, and the lacewings, these chemicals do not discriminate pest versus beneficial. So when you're spraying insecticides in your garden, you're potentially also impacting your desirable species. And so that's kind of a shift in thinking. Rather than managing against the undesirable insects in your garden, managing for the beneficial insects that will help you control the less desirable insect species. Okay, bottom line, I've hit these points many times, many times. So this is just repetition at this point, but diversity in a system makes it inherently more resilient. An example that comes to mind off the top of my head is like, in my hometown, they planted all of the streets with American elms as shade trees. How many of those American elms are still in my hometown? None of them, because Dutch elm disease came through and wiped them all out. If they had instead planted a diversity of shade trees, there would probably still be a number of very nice mature shade trees in my hometown, but there are not. So diversity in a system makes it resilient against diseases, pests, drought, a lot of other things. Here are the 3 strategies I hit on many times. I included this research citation slide in here so that it can be available in the PDF version of my slides if you want to dig into some of these actual review papers and peer-reviewed research articles. I am now in the habit of throwing this in as my last slide in all of my presentations. I'm coming to you from Johnson County, where we had a very stressful fall wildfire season. So please make sure you're taking care of yourself, checking in with your neighbors. This helpline is the Ag Stress number, and these folks are trained to, they work in agriculture. They know the stresses and the unique situations that a lot of people find themselves in. So there's that. 988 is the crisis helpline. If you know someone that is in immediate emergency, 988. How'd I do? We've got a few minutes for questions. Yes, I will take it back to the reference slide. Yes. So this Chalker-Scott paper was the one that the QR code went to. But yeah.
Do you know if there's any annual plants in their experimentation with the polyculture stuff?
Annual plants, perennial plants. Yeah. So that's something that gets more into the permaculture space, is thinking about integrating perennial cropping systems together. There is work out there. I did not dig into it a ton for this presentation. And there are not many perennial food-bearing plants in Wyoming outside of like trees and shrubs, or mainly where you would be, the berries.
On the permaculture, it's a portmanteau. It's 2 words put together, permanent and agriculture.
Yes.
That's just for Gina's information.
Yes, yeah. I did not focus on that. I should have said that. I was making the assumption for this talk, mostly like annual vegetable crops, but there is work out there. Thank you.
Will these slides be available to us? Okay.
Yes, they will. And this was also recorded, and it will be online eventually. Yes. Yes, this is my email. This is my office phone number. Send me your questions. I'm happy to chat. There might be someone in the state in an extension office closer to you than Johnson County, but I'm happy to direct questions however I can. Was there another question back here?
And this is totally off topic.
Yeah.
But have you seen any evidence of emerald ash borer in Buffalo? We've heard it's in Sheridan. I'm from Gillette. We've heard it's in Sheridan. Do you know?
I have not seen any evidence for it in Buffalo. That was the other example with the tree, monoculture. Yeah, trees. Yeah. I guess, yes, I've heard that it's moving into Sheridan. It will be everywhere before it's all said and done. So it's only a matter of time. Yeah. I do not recommend anyone go out and spend a bunch of money on a green ash and plant it in your front yard. Yeah.
Any ideas for small garden traps?
Small garden traps, like
Like if you have a small garden, what are some good ideas for traps?
trap crops or like physical traps?
No, trap crops.
Trap crops. A lot of the brassica kind of family do well as trap crops. Is radish, that's not a brassica technically. I'll say that again, Amy.
So, not to jump in or anything, but it really depends on what kind of insects that you're seeing is depending on what kind of trap crops you're going to want to use.
That's true. It depends on the insects, and it depends on the cash crop that you're trying to protect.
If you're seeing like a lot of Colorado potato beetles, like I know we have in Goshen County, probably everywhere, then you obviously don't want to plant a lot of potatoes. You kind of do, but you want to, like Micah was saying, the more diversity you have, you confuse those insects so they can't find them as easily. And so you may want to just plant some potatoes or cucumbers or whatever it is that you're seeing a lot of those insects on the perimeter or on the outside. So when they hit your garden, they're going to hit those first and get their fill before they move into the garden.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. We got a few more minutes, and I will add, I'm going to be around all day at the meeting, so if you want to grab me later and chat about any of this, I'm happy to do that. Any final questions? Wonderful. Thank you for your time. Thanks for being here today and supporting this conference. Appreciate it.